and I welcome you to the seventh session of this faculty endowment lecture organized by the Department of English of Sri Krishna Adithya College of Arts and Science. For the last few weeks, we have been seeing the lecture series given by our chief guest, Mr. A. John Paul Bhubadi, who is working as assistant professor of English in Sri Krishna Aditya College of Arts and Science. The previous two sessions were about the enduring legacy of classical criticism, on which the first lecture was on Plato and Aristotle, and the continuation of which was conducted 2 weeks before under the topic lecture on Roman and Latin classicist. As and to continue with the previous topics, in today's session, the speaker will be continuing his lecture on the topic shaping the landscape of literary discourse and concentrating on the pioneers of English criticism. I take this opportunity again to welcome our speaker of today, Mr. A. John Paul Bhupati, and sir, you can start.
So, good evening, all. Thank you so much, sir, for your wonderful introduction. I'll just present my screen. Okay. So, dear participants, it is with immense pleasure that I am here before you today to deliver this lecture on the three most celebrated critics, writers of English literature, Sir Philip Sidney, Ben Jonson, and Dryden. So I think this title of this session will justify these three great scholars, the pioneers of English criticism, and they have actually shaped the landscape of literary discourse in English literature. And these three literary giants, they have collectively, uh, they were spanning the Elizabethan, Jacobean, and Restoration eras in England, and they have left an indelible mark on the landscape of all the forms of art: English poetry, drama, and criticism. And their works, they still continue to captivate readers and inspire scholars in many ways. Right, they are offering timeless insights to the condition of human nature, and they also give the complexities of society. These three uh, critics here, of course, they have different personality, since they lived in different times, and they have contributed well enough, uh, as they were pioneering the study. Sir Philip Sidney was the epitome of Renaissance, and who had that intellectual prowess, right? He was renowned for his Arcadia, which was a prose romance, and that exemplified the Renaissance ideals of beauty, virtue, and heroism. Of course, his Defense of Poesy is a very great seminal work of literary criticism, which was uh, on record is the pioneering work of English criticism. Whereas the other way, Ben Jonson was the greatest playwright of all time, especially in terms of English literature, who was celebrated for his mastery of language and his keen observation of human nature, right, and his way of making satirical ideas in place. Uh, he's known for his comedies, especially The Alchemist and Walpole, which exposed the follies and vices of society. Then, the most important critic, who was considered to be the father of English criticism, John Dryden, who had the undisputed master of restoration verse, who was hailed for his mastery of form and the vibrant imagery that he used in his poetry and verse, and who was most known for his Absalom and Achtophel. right, which was a political allegory in heroic couplets. So these three great masters uh, contributed uh, the, the extraordinary um, effects to English literature. So we'll dwell into the poetic and dramatic works of these three greatest writers, and maybe I'll try to make it justified that these three writers are the true pioneers of English criticism. Before we move on to those three greatest writers, I would like to give you the background of English criticism because it is mandatory or it becomes very necessary to study the basics of English criticism. You know, after Chaucer until the mid of 16th century, uh, excuse me, I'll represent my slide. Hope my slide is visible.
Yes, sir, it is visible, sir.
Yes. So, after Chaucer till the mid of 16th century, there was no great poets in English literature, and they were poets and they were writers between these time, but there was no remarkable or notable poet. It was only after the Renaissance time, um, only after the greatest invention of Renaissance, the printing press, the Greek and Latin treatises on criticism became available to the English scholars. So only then they began to apply their minds uh, in different aspects of literature in English. The first regular critics to do so were the Cambridge friends. We call them as Cambridge friends. Sir John Chick, Roger Ascham, and Thomas Wilson. And they were considered to be the uh, uh, Cambridge friends, or in a way they were their contribution were called included in Cambridge school, and they were the first regular critics of English, and they were devoted. They were actually devoted scholars of the classics. They just followed how they, uh, what they have read and what they have learned from the classical ideas. Uh, they followed Italian uh, contribution mostly from Dante, right? And they also followed the French and sometimes Greek scholars. Their object was to improve English for literary and other purposes along classical lines, but not to denationalize it by the excessive borrowings. What will happen when some excessive borrowing happen? That will purely become foreign influence, right? So they did not want to have that. And in one of the essays, Check, Sir John Check makes it like, he says that, I'll read out that phrase for you. I am of this opinion that our own tongue should be written clean and pure, unmixed and unmangled with borrowings of other tongues. So he wanted his language to be great, and they want to contribute something to the greatness of their language. So this is how the battle of tastes actually in English criticism started. And that time English prose was still in that beginning period, and these three Cambridge scholars, they started paying more attention to the English prose than of any other literary issues and problems, and they followed the classical ideas very closely in whatever the way that they made the critical approaches, but they never lost their sight, right? In a way they also had the ideas or mindset to improve their native language and literature, following the classical lines. And that comes the another greatest reformation in uh, English verse called Aeropagus. It was around 1579. A kind of admiration for the classics took a new turn, and about that time was formed a literary circle called Areopagus that aimed at the reformation of English verse by substituting the Greek and Latin system of prose formulas for the English literature. So they called themselves as Areopagus, right? And that was the highest authority in literary matters in England. The background of that name is it was actually a name of a hill in ancient Athens, right? That is situated in the highest court of the state. Okay, and there were a very great eminent personalities available in that Areopagus. One was Philip Sidney. I also given the other names: um, Gabriel Harvey, Edmund Spencer, Edward Dyer. Right? There are many more people who contributed more through this Areopagus. In a matter of fact, what they tried through this literary reformation, they wanted to uh, uh, given enough space for English verse or English ideas than are making like rather than Greek and Latin system, especially in prose. So there comes lots of beautiful prose works, including epistles like letters containing or prefaces, prologues, right? Prologue to the works. So this system of the classical learning turned naturally to the modern ideas. So all like Sidney, Spencer, Dyer, they all contributed or they have given enough support for the new literary traditional English way. And in around 15 the same year 1579, there was very crucial controversy developed in England that was called the attack on poetry and its defense. Uh, Stephen Gosson, a classical scholar of English, who gave an essay called The School of Abuse in 1579, and without getting the permission of Sidney, he dedicated it to Philip Sidney. After 3 years of time, around 1560, Philip Sidney gave a reply to Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse. That was not just a reply to Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse essay, but it has become an defense of English poetry, and it has become an advice book for English poets and English scholars what to be followed to avoid such kind of um, uh, controversial attack on poetry. Stephen Gosson had some the uh, basic pattern for making this comment on or the attack on English poetry. You should understand the background of that age by that time. When Queen Elizabeth was the ruler of England, uh, after the foundations of the English church called Anglicanism, Church of England, which declared independent of Rome, made more secure for the people who followed religious ideas. Then there was also a Spanish threat to the security of England that ended in destruction of the entire armada called Invisible Armada. Hope you would have studied. Dr. Shantakumari in a previous lecture very beautifully explained that Spanish Armada, and that made England very powerful in sea. Uh, Moreover, there was a steady flow started happening in England, and people were of in great peace. Uh, in terms of literature, the ancient learning of Greece and Rome, Greek literature and Roman literature, they were creating a kind of realm of poetry and other forms in England. So playwrights or poets or in other forms of artists, they started just following what was written or what was used in the ancient classics. So a kind of harmful effects on morals happened, created by the Puritans in Elizabethan society, because these Puritans are always need change in pattern. They wanted purity, or they wanted moral, they wanted greatness, right? In the humbleness or sublimity in everything. So, in a way, that this scholar Stephen Garson was a Puritan, and he started attacking English poetry, calling it as the school of abuse. And Philip Sidney, uh, actually, Philip Sidney was a direct literarian. He was not born poet, or his profession was not poetry or literature, but he was a knight, right? He was a soldier. Okay, you would have uh, heard the statement, "Thy need is greater than mine." This dialogue was told by Philip Sidney in a war field where he was mortally injured. But when he offered his drink, like the water that he contained, to a fellow soldier who was half injured, right? Who was better injured than Philip Sidney. So, giving that water, he told the statement, "Thy need is greater than mine." Philip Sidney, when he received that uh, uh, the attack on poetry by Stephen Garson, when it was dedicated to Philip Sidney, he had that treatise for nearly around 3 years, and he gave a reply around 1580, and he called it as the defense of poesy, or in other words, it is apology for poetry. Here, Philip Sidney is more recent, and more he becomes very important, and he deserves that kind of section, right, to be concentrated, or to be called as the first regular critic of English literature. uh, Philip Sidney, when he gave reply to Stephen Garson, he gave it in I mean the attack of poetry are counted into four. It goes like, when a man could employ his time more usefully than poetry, and he calls English poetry as mother of lies. He calls it as nurse of abuse, and he makes the Plato's banishment of poets in his ideal city. Uh, he refers to that and calls it that English poetry is what exactly referred to by Plato, right in his Republic. And Sidney is not trying to give a reply to Stephen Garson, but he is trying much more than that. And Sidney's method is a kind of logician, and he examines the entire attack of attack on poetry in whole and parts, and he considers the points in favor and points against, and then he sets forth his main thesis. And uh, so that's why Philip Sidney's apology for poetry is deserving the laurel crown. And he answers to all the accusations of Stephen Garson. So he turns to the uh, uh, four charges laid by Stephen Garson. Taking the first, that man might better spend his time than in poetry, Philip Sidney answers like, see, if it is so, uh, that no learning is so good, right, as that which teaches and moves people to virtue, and none can both teach and move there to so much. Any other learning, like not only poetry, right? Nothing is so special here, and his answer is like, no learning in the world can teach the best like poetry. So, in a conclusion, he says, uh, something that is written on paper, right, mere something that is inked in paper cannot be more profitable. But poetry is not in such a way. In poetry, there is virtue. In poetry, there is logic. In poetry, there is a philosophical input. In poetry, there is delight. So, a reader or a scholar who is in need of anything can get through poetry. So, poetry can be the best employment of time. So, a man could employ his time more usefully in poetry than any other aspect. This is what his counterpart in first attack. Second attack, the mother of lies. He says, poets are not liars. Wait, see, poets are actually, they are concerned about truths. Right? Poet has no concern other than that telling facts. So poet tells facts, poet tells past and present, and poet is a mere observer or one who deliberately explains the future. Hope you remember how we studied Aristotle. When Aristotle talks about poetry, he says poets are like they are divinely inspired, right? And they merely imitate what is the best to the society. So following that, he says poet uses all the facts to make it to arrive to a higher truth. So poets are not liars, right? They are not actually lies, but they are all interpretations which can bring to offer the best truth. Okay. Then third condemnation, to answer to that third charge, he says it is not abusing men's wit. Actually, what happens is men's wit that abuse poetry. It is not man. I mean, it is not poetry that abuses men. It is actually man's wit that abuses poetry. Wit here makes a different sense, right? So, uh, poetry is not the nurse of abuse. It no way it nurses abusiveness, but it teaches men what is the right value to be followed in life. The best part of it is the last one, that is Plato's condemnation of poets from, or banishment of poets in his ideal city Callipolis. He says poets are Plato considered poetry as divinely inspired. Plato does not condemn, or Plato does not want poets who are, I mean, he does not condemn poets generally. What Plato condemns, I mean, what kind of condemnation Plato makes here is the poets who make lustful thoughts, the poets who make unnecessary ideas in poetry, the poets who make unlawful things, the poets who talk about um, immoral values, right, which are of no use to the society. He condemns such kind of poets and poetry. So Plato considered poetry as divinely inspired, and when it is misused, it is rejected. But it is rightly used, Plato accepts them. So by referring to the ideas mentioned in Plato's Republic, Sidney tries to give these I mean, the positive ideas about Plato's rejection. So here, with these reply, Sidney tries to make the uh, the greatness of English poetry. And now, in the second part of his apology for poetry, Sidney gives the classical rules, or he lies the he prepares to lay down the rules for English poetry. And in many way, Philip Sidney follows Aristotle, and he advocated for the uh, uh, classical meters, and he respected the rules, right? And he wanted poetry to be English, not of ancient Greece or ancient Rome. So he wanted English poets to follow the greatest works of Greece and Rome or Latin for some time, and create great masterpieces in English, so that the masterpieces created in English can be the model for the future poets. So, in a way, telling this or remarking this, Philip Sidney calls poets as makers, right? They are comparable to heavenly makers. And he calls poetry is an art of imitation, following Aristotle, and for Aristotle termed it as mimesis with the end to teach and delight. While telling teach and delight, in partly he follows Plato, partly he follows Aristotle, and he also makes references, he also takes references with Horace and other greatest scholars of classics. So, by following Aristotle, right? Aristotle had to stress only on unity of, the unities that he talked about. He also talks about the unity. When he talks about the unity, when Philip Sidney talks about unity, and he started praising the uh, the first English tragedy, Garbodek, right? You know, Garbodek was the first English tragedy written by Thomas Sackville and Thomas Norton in 1561, and he praises that for the technique used, right? He actually calls that technique as the Senecan technique. You know, Seneca is known for his tragedies. Senecan technique, right? In a way that in fact was the only tragedy for, I mean, tragedy of note written till this day by the time. And Sidney here makes lots of ideas about the tragedy, comedy, and different styles in drama. And Sidney truly rejects the tragic comedy, the mixture of tragedy and comedy in a single play. Because by the time when Sidney makes this comment, there were no great tragic comedies available. You know, only after the arrival of Shakespeare, or maybe a few years before Shakespeare, there were some tragic comedies available in English, and they were justified. To be frank, John Dryden justified tragic comedy. Only after that, the tragic comedy was highly explored or highly accepted to be. But by the time when Sidney wrote this, or when during the time of Sidney, there were no tragic comedies, so he rejected it. And Sidney insisted the unity of action, place, and time, following Aristotle. For that, he praised Garbodek. He is very heavily criticized the tragic comedy, and he makes a statement like poetry is the art of inventing new things better than this world has to offer. And by telling that, he makes lots of references to his own time. And he but when we talk about Philip Sidney's idea of classicism, he makes like, I mean, he takes like verse is superior form of expression to ordinary prose. By telling that, he is not rejecting the verse, I mean, he's not rejecting the prose pieces, but he offers more credits to the verse, right? Poetry. You know, of course, Philip Sidney's poems, Astrophil and Stella, such kind of poems are greatest for, and they are known for the greatness of verse. Then he always follows Aristotle for all his statements, and he calls like poetry is an art of imitation for a specific purpose, because poetry has something to teach and delight. You know, Aristotle, when he makes that statement, art of imitation, Aristotle had no idea of specific purpose. But when Sidney adapts that, he makes it like poetry has a specific purpose. That specific purpose is teaching and delighting. And teaching and delighting here is an inseparable events, right? That happens through poetry. When you take any poetry, as I mean, according to Philip Sidney, it it does the work both teaching and delighting, right? It takes the two fold activity, right? It conducts two-fold activity, teaching and delighting. So for that, Philip Sidney says poetry's end is like ending end of all earthly learning, right? It has the incentive, or it has the virtuous action, right? You know, delight to move men to take the goodness in hand happens only in poetry. For Aristotle, poetry was just an art of imitation for natural pleasure, right? Like I explained, for Aristotle, the uh, when he defines poetry, he calls it as art of imitation. For Aristotle, that art of imitation happens for natural pleasure. That natural pleasure is imitation. Whereas when Sidney takes that statement, he makes it very clear that art of imitation here happens for a specific purpose. And that specific purpose is again imitation, but that imitation, what does that imitation make here is, it is teaching and delighting, right? That is very important. And it delights men, it moves men, right? It takes them to the goodness in hand. All these are happening in poetry. That's why he calls poetry as the ending end of all earthly learning. And any art that like poetry, it is declared as superior to philosophy, or it is superior to history, it is superior to science and law, all forms of art, because it is the ending end of earthly learning. That's what he makes. And unconsciously, Philip Sidney differs with Aristotle when he gives meaning to imitation. Right? That is what I explained. He goes like poetry is not so much an art of imitation, like it is not inventing, and as of invention or creation, it is creating a new world altogether, right? For the delight of the reader, poetry is creating a new world. So here he makes an unconscious statement, rejecting Plato's ideas, right? Hope you remember what Plato comes up with in his theory of ideas. Ideas are ultimate reality, things are copies of ideas. So in art, what happens when it talks about a material thing, as material is once removed from reality, in art it is twice removed from reality. It is a copy of copy, it is not original. That is what Plato's statement in theory of ideas, right? Hope you remember. So here he makes an unconscious statement: poetry is not copying any copy, or poetry itself is not a copy. What happens here is, in art of imitation, like unlike invention or creation, poetry is creating a new world, and that new world happens in imagination, right? uh, he echoes Plato again, right, when he says that the final end of poetry is, of all learning, is to lead to is to lead, or is to transport, is to move men to virtue. In such ways, Sidney echoes Plato, but he makes unconscious statements like that poetry produces or creates a new world altogether for edification and delight of the reader. These are all unconscious statements of Philip Sidney. Uh, there are many more things to be discussed about Philip Sidney. Uh, you know, Philip Sidney did not contribute directly to English criticism, but after 3 years of the School of Abuse, the treatise by Stephen Garson, around in 1580, when Philip Sidney wrote this Defense of Poesy, it was not considered a mere reply to Stephen Garson's accusation. Instead, he makes very many practical statements to the fellow poets and fellow critics in English, or the contemporaries, or the critics who came after Philip Sidney. It was a kind of guiding work. He insisted, or he laid down rules for unwritten rules, like for poets and critics. uh, See, all these are all to make things great, right? So in a way, he justified his space, or justifies his role in Areopagus, right? Areopagus, the literary circle, was created to give enough space for vernacular, English vernacular, right? Local vernacular, rather than following Greeks, Latin or Roman classics. Philip Sidney's idea was very great, telling that English poets or English writers should follow Greeks, Latin or Roman, create best works in English, so that the people who come after them can follow the English models rather than following Greek models once again. This is what Philip Sidney's entire idea and defense of poetry. And following this model, we move on to the next critic, Ben Jonson, who is better known as poet and dramatist. Right? Hope some of you would have studied that Ben Jonson was the greatest dramatist than Shakespeare, because Shakespeare has acted in Ben Jonson's place. In Every Man in His Humor, Shakespeare was a minor actor, right? He acted. So in a way, we can understand, like, Shakespeare learned his basic stage skills in Ben Jonson's School of Drama. So he is notable for many works, plays, especially comedies of that time. In terms of criticism, Ben Jonson's The Poetaster, or The Conversations with Drummond, and Discoveries, right? Actually, the full title of Discoveries is Discoveries Made Upon Men and Matter. That was the full title, commonly known as Discoveries. These are all the very most important critical treatises of Ben Jonson. And he saw the dangerous situation in English poetry, and he created the control over English poetry and drama by advocating the native tradition. Uh, you know, uh, there were some writers in English who were divinely gifted, like Shakespeare, right? Or in prose, we have Bacon. They were all divinely gifted because they have not practiced or they have not learned anything from other schools. They were divinely gifted. But the other writers of his time, Ben Jonson's time, uh, they had to undergo certain kind of certain type of training, right, for their craft. So that was advocated by Ben Jonson, and he calls it as heaven sent moments, right? There is one statement in Ben Jonson's discoveries. He calls it as heaven sent moments. That means poets cannot, not all poets can be great. So who can become great is the poets who wait for the heaven sent moments and capture the heaven sent moments at the right point and produce it as work of art, either poetry or drama, whatever. So his critical views, he followed Aristotle, Horace, and he followed Seneca, right? And he followed Quintilian. You know, the only critic, to be frank, in English, who followed Quintilian's ideas was Ben Jonson. And he was a true neoclassicist. In a way, Philip Sidney, who unconsciously started English criticism, era of English criticism, Ben Jonson, who made greatest development the same time. The true neoclassicism started with John Dryden, but he paved way for classical ideas or neoclassical ideas in English. He made lots of repeated assertions, right, on behalf of the literary dictatorship of his age. For that kind in English, he followed lots of utterances in the most valuable critics of Latin and Greek, uh, and maybe he can be called as the first significant neoclassical critic in English. Then about his classicism, he followed in so many ways, right? Though being Elizabethan, he followed in so many ways Aristotle and Horace when he calls about classical ideas, and he says, or actually he condemns English writers, both poets and dramatists. He calls them as their excess. Excess here means their excess they have excess of passion, they have excess of imagination, and they have excess of expression. You know, you can just simply think of it. When something is excess, it is of no use. And there is no exception here for Shakespeare. When Ben Jonson makes this comment, even the great Shakespeare was not free from these excess. And there were all the consequence of ungoverned impulse. See what happened. What happened in English criticism or English drama or English poetry at that time of Ben Jonson was uh, uh, the writers, to make their works great, what they did is, what they did was they just followed the classical ideas. For example, if one writer who wanted to produce a good tragedy in English, he would immediately follow the tragedies of Greeks or tragedies of Latin, sometimes tragedies of French. So what happens here? The emotions, the passions, the imagination, the expression, the choice of words and the presentation, everything becomes over excess. So by no chance it, it appeals to the emotions of the audience. So a poet who was quick to see all these kind of concepts, right, will be in ruining his purpose. So Ben Jonson here makes a statement like the fable, right, which was called as the imitation of one entire and perfect action whose parts are joined and they have a knit together, as nothing in the structure can be changed and taken away, right, without making it weak. In the sense, without making the content weak. And for that, he says that there is a proportionable magnitude needed, right, which means the proportionable greatness needed. Proportionable greatness here means any act in terms of drama, any act that should have a proper beginning, proper middle, and proper end. It is the same statement which was mentioned by Aristotle. Any act which has the proper beginning, proper middle, and proper end is the proportionable greatness. Right? That was the proportionable greatness. If the action is too great, right, and we can never comprehend the whole togetherness in our imagination. That is impossible. For that, you can take example of Shivaji Ganeshan. No, I can refer to one movie here so that you will clearly understand. There is one movie in Tamil called Rajpat Rangadurai, which was acted by Shivaji Ganeshan. In the movie, Shivaji Ganeshan will act as a Rajpat, which means like a king, a landlord. And in drama, he used to be very generous and he gives everything that he has to the people. So in drama, no men around the character is poor or is out of food, right? And he offers everything that he has to the people, and he makes his people happy. He keeps his people happy and safe. But in reality, after the end of drama, he will have the worst condition in life, and he himself will not have anything to eat. So that is reality, right? So this kind of action, when the action is too great, we can never comprehend the whole action together in our imagination. So if you happen to watch that movie, when you have a kind of feel or emotion over one scene, before you end up your imagination or before you consume each act or each reaction shown by the character, the next plot will begin. So you cannot keep everything together in our imagination. And when it is very low, when it is too little, what happens? No pleasure arises. For that, you can take examples of the Telugu movies. Maybe I can give another example. See, one movie is written and directed in Tamil or one source language. Uh, that movie is remade in another language. The movie is translated to the source language and presented. Imagine how it would be. So where uh, the emotion will be too little and there comes no pleasure out of object. So what is actually needed is the proportionable greatness. For that, he says the unities, right? The unities laid by Aristotle: unity of time, unity of place, and unity of action. When unity of place, time, and action are rightly followed, and this extraordinary efforts apply, and that has become the proportionable greatness. And he makes some qualifications for a poet. He calls poet as the maker, and poetry as fiction, right? Fiction or the art of feigning, he calls. And the end fruit of poetry is delighting, giving delight to the readers. For that, to make a poetry best, or to the question what makes a best poet, what makes the best poetry, Ben Jonson lays down 5 requirements. When a poet follows these 5 requirements, he becomes a great poet. It is like a poet should be great by nature, he should be great by exercise, he should be great by imitation, he should be great by study, and he should be great by art. This can be very simply explained. Like, there is one point called wit, and that wit is attained. Wit is a poet thing, or wit is an artistic thing. It is attained only in exercising. It is not natural gift. Some of you are in video mode. I am sorry that it disturbs. Please. Okay, thank you. So, to Ben Jonson, the best outcome happens in poetry when a poet is naturally gifted. So, availing that, nature can be a beneficial thing and it can be an aiding thing, and it is not possible for all poets because all poets cannot be naturally gifted, unlike few, like as I mentioned earlier, Shakespeare is naturally gifted, right? Shakespeare is divinely gifted, like Bacon is divinely gifted in prose. So in such way, natural beneficiary or natural gift is not possible for all. And to attain that natural greatness, what can be done is that perfection of nature can be extracted through exercising those parts. It means being frequent to the greatest writing. So a rhymer or a poet, what he can do is he can make himself frequently available to the greatest writings of all time. When he exercises that in his own imagination, in his own way, he becomes great. The third requisite here is uh, poet is poet becomes great in his imitation. So what to be imitated is nature. The substance should be richer. It should be richer of other poets, right? And to make choice of one excellent man above the other people, rest of the people, what he has to do is he should not copy. When he makes a copy, it becomes a mistake. The principal objective of imitation is being truthful. That is, you should be very truthful to the nature and imitate what exactly is it. So very often you can find this statement. Uh, Artist or poetry, maybe any form of art. Artist representing what actually it is. It is representing something, right? So it is representing something that actually is. That is what real imitation. Imitation is not copying. Mere copying is not imitation. So he says, like the bee takes honey from the flower without disturbing the other natural process. A poet should copy, poet should imitate a natural action. In that imitation, when that imitation is perfectly done, he becomes a greatest. Then the fourth requirement is the exactness of study and multiplicity of reading. Right? So, as Bacon says, reading maketh the perfect man. Ben Jonson comes up with the same kind of statement. By multiplicity of reading, that makes a full man and a poet becomes great. Finally, it is art, right? That art only can lead a poet to perfection, right? And art only can leave the poet in possession, right? He can learn anything through the greatest artist, right? For that he takes example of Horace and Aristotle, right? For Aristotle, the world owes the principles of art of writing. Like he makes a statement like, let me read it out for you. Out of many men's perfections in a science, he forms still one art. So he makes that kind of statement. And nature, uh, exercise, imitation, study, and art, that makes the poet in chief. So a poet becomes great when he is naturally gifted. If not naturally gifted, the poet can attain that natural gift by exercising the great arts. Then, being truthful to the imitation, he can become great. And by studying, making multiplicity of reading, he can become great. And finally, art that lead a poet to perfection. So these five requirements Ben Jonson creates for a good poet. Then he starts observing the in style. He says he attacks the extravagance of expression in his contemporary, especially Elizabethan and Jacobean writers. He applies uh, a noble sensoriness, which means to Ben Jonson, language actually owes its life to thought. So what is life uh, to a body? Similarly, a language is to a thought, right? So language bears the same relation uh, as the body to the soul. So it is lifeless without soul, right? A body is lifeless without soul. Similarly, a thought is without. A thought is lifeless without the language. So, being its function, he makes many other statements. What to be chosen? What kind of language to be chosen? Right? The choice of words and arrangement of words. In terms of choice of words and arrangement of words, he says like the when a poet reads the best writers, and when a poet reads, poet observes the best speakers, and poet exercises of his own style, he takes this great efforts, choice of words and arrangement of words. Choice of words, in choice of words, he makes one element very clear, that poet should not choose any word that comes first. He cannot arrange it. He has to wait, right? A poet should wait for the right words. When maybe like when he starts writing a poem on a, a flower rose, when he looks at the flower rose, there will be so many words coming up. He cannot line all those words and make it into poetry. He will have to wait for the right words. When the right words are picked up, say for example, if 100 words appear before him when he started writing poetry, he will have to shortlist those words, reject a few, and select the other few. In the selection, you will have to restrict a few words and reform some words, and finally come up with list of words which could be used in his poetry. So this is right choice of words. That is naturally done when he is reading the best writers. And arrangement of words, he cannot arrange words one after another. For poetry, there are rules laid by the classics. Maybe certain rules are changed in the neoclassical ideas. According to that, the poet arranges words. So that is best done when he observes the best speakers. And reading the best writers, observing the best speakers, after that following it in his own style. That makes the work the great, the style the great. And for that he says, ready writing makes not good writing. Ready writing in the sense, it is just opposite to what Wordsworth defined poetry. It is not a spontaneous overflow. It is not possible. To Ben Jonson, it is not possible. Maybe when we study William Wordsworth, we can justify that poetry is spontaneous overflow. But to Ben Jonson, it is not a spontaneous overflow, right? It is not something that happens in the tranquil recollection. It is not a spontaneous thing. It is not an easy thing. Poet has to wait for the right moment, right? Poet has to wait for the right words. So ready writing makes not good writing. But what happens is, good writing brings on ready writing. That means when a poet is great at observing the best speakers and reading the best writers, right? Making himself multiplying the reading, right? What happens is, what happens here? Whatever he writes will become a good writing, and that brings the ready writing. So here you can take example of Kannadasan in Tamil, or Shelley, right, in English, Bharatiyar in Tamil. There are so many poets we can call it. And the greatest of all time in Tamil short stories, Jayakanthan, right? You can take Pudumai Pithan. They are all very spontaneous in their thoughts. That does not, that actually did not happen all of a sudden. And they were very much acceptable, right, of reading their ancestors, right, reading the best writings, observing the best speaking, right, and exercising of their own style. So this is of style. Then he delivers greatest estimates on Bacon and Shakespeare, and in Discoveries he makes lots of statements about Bacon and Shakespeare, and he also makes statements about other writers like Montaigne, Spencer, and Christopher Marlowe. But he dedicated a few number of pages for Bacon and Shakespeare, and he called Bacon and Shakespeare as the masters of closely packed style. Especially he calls, he gives this statement for Bacon, right? Because to Ben Jonson, Bacon is the greatest master of prose. You can have Ben Jonson is also the same way, right? And they have made themselves as masters of the closely packed style. That means Ben Jonson, even in Discovery, he calls Bacon as 20 things in 10 words. He calls Bacon, or he makes a statement for Bacon, telling that Bacon can make 20 things, 20 different ideas, and explain that in just 10 words, right? So words without matter. That's what Bacon's greatness. And when he talks about Shakespeare, he calls Shakespeare as the honest person, which means honest in delivering ideas. Then he says that Shakespeare is known for the brave notions used in his art, in art form, and Shakespeare is great for his gentle expression. So here you must understand that though Ben Jonson was a senior, right, in terms of time and in terms of playwriting, to Shakespeare, Ben Jonson actually being honest, describing Shakespeare, right? He does not consider Shakespeare as his rival, right? He learnt, of course, Shakespeare is naturally gifted, divinely inspired, but still, Shakespeare learnt the basics of theatres, the basics of stage from Ben Jonson's school of drama, right? Ben Jonson, when he talks about Shakespeare in his discoveries of men and matter, he calls Shakespeare as the greatest of all time, right? Like gentle expression. He's known for his gentle expression. So he also makes some concepts of rules, right? In his critical ideas, he says rules of the ancient are very important for the greatness of art in any time, but the application should be of own. It is like, maybe I'll take another 2-3 minutes to conclude. Um, Ben Jonson says like classical rules are very important for the modern time in the sense Ben Jonson's time, but how it should be taken is, how it should be accepted as, the application must be of the own, right, from writer's part. So he calls like truth lies open to all. It is no man's several. Several here means private property, right? He says like truth is open to all. It is not private property of one. So classical rules can be observed. Classical rules can be followed, not as guides, right? Sorry, just as guides, not as commanders, right? So rules cannot command. When rules command, that becomes waste in expression. So what he tells us in the concept of rules, the contemporary writers of Ben Jonson, in order to become great, they should follow the classical ideas. They should take the classical rules as guides and accept it and apply it by their own, right? They should not allow the classical rules to command them. In the sense, for example, take Spencer. Spencer tried to make one epic, but actually Spencer tried to make epic twice, but he failed. Not the artistic failure, but maybe there are so many reasons for it. There must be so many reasons for it. Why Spencer was not able to produce great epics of by that time was, Spencer allowed the classical rules as commanding. Spencer wanted to make an epic exactly how it was presented in the classics, like Greeks or Latin. In another way, why Milton was able to reach that height, how Milton was able to produce the greatest of English epics, Paradise Lost, when he tried second time with his Paris Regained, he was almost he was able to complete, or he was able to reach that greatest height again once again, but uh, since it is right out of time, he was not able to do it. Okay, why Milton was able to do it? Milton was able to achieve where Spencer was not. In the sense, Milton followed the classical ideas as guides. He kept all the classical ideas as guides, right? Those classical ideas guided Milton, whereas Spencer made them to command it. In the sense, Spencer wanted to exactly produce an epic like Greeks, like Latin, whereas Milton tried to produce of his own. He followed classical concept rules, but he applied it by his own. So that's what he says, truth lies open to all. If it is truth to Greek, it is truth to Italian, it is truth to French, it is truth to an English, whoever. It is not a private property. So when the classical ideas become commanding, it brings damage in infinite manner. So by all these mean, Ben Jonson become very great pioneer, right, in his ideas produced for classical English criticism. And when he talks about the judgment, he says To judge of poets is only the faculty of poets, and not of all of poets, but the best. Here, with this statement, what he tries to explain is it is not a fact like judging poets in the sense you cannot take all the poets in English and judge that they are bad, they are worse. Judgment should be with the best, because the poets who are not able to achieve the greatness, right, are not bad poets, but they are trying to become great. They are trying to become the best. So judgment should be with the best poets. And here the excellent and true judgment will happen only with reason, right, not with thought. So here with all these, Ben Jonson's contribution to critical art is only the curb, right? It is like the necessity of making code of conduct for all, like for drama, for poetry, and for criticism, for writer, for critic, whatever, right? So he trusted the training, right, more than the natural inspiration. So Ben Jonson was the first critic who offered very plain and positive statements to the critics of all time, of the writers of all his contemporaries, of the other writers in the next ages to be followed. He was very plain, right? He was very passive, right, in making statements. He's not very crucial. He's not making very strong condemnations, right, like other critics which we have seen in the previous lectures, like Quintilian or Horace. He's not making strong condemnation. He's not like Plato. He followed all the greatest writers of classics, but he was very passive, right? And he says natural ability is what the real thing in poetry, in artist, right? Like Shakespeare is naturally gifted or divinely inspired. There are so many writers like Shakespeare who were naturally gifted, naturally inspired, divinely inspired. But that natural gift, that natural source can be acquired, can be achieved by repeated practice. So he trusted on training more than the natural inspiration. See, that is often becomes the law of Ben Jonson, right? So I have a few slides on slides to describe Dr. Jonson, right? So whenever I talk about Dr. Jonson, I become over enthusiastic. Maybe I can discuss that in our next session, maybe on next Friday. Thank you so much for listening. Here I have some disturbances, right? I had some disturbances. I had power cut and other things, so I was not able to be fluent in the beginning. Maybe I can mention that I have done justice to these two critics, Philip Sidney and Ben Jonson. If you have any queries, you can raise.
Participants, if you have any doubts or things to be clarified, you can use the chat box or you can unmute yourselves and talk to the speaker.